Buckle up, buddies, because we're booking it through this topic. My name is Stefano Vera, I use he, him pronouns, and I read the article, The Social Costs of Gender Nonconformity for Transgender Adults, Implications for Discrimination and Health by Lisa R. Miller and Eric Anthony Grollman. Now, I've got to preface this with the fact that there's a major issue with the paper. It poorly defined gender nonconformity and featured one of the worst research methodologies since a double-barreled question. For those of you who are unaware, a double-barreled question is a question that asks two questions at the same time when it really should be split off into two. Now, the paper's definition for gender nonconformity had been that, as a term, it is used as a way to signify that one's gender expression breaks cultural expectations for normatively doing gender. They'd gotten the definition from Weston Zimmerman's article, Doing Gender, which had been published in 1987 in the publication Gender and Society. The issue is that this definition fails to clarify whether the gender nonconformity is for the gender that the individual was assigned at birth, or if it's the gender that they've transitioned to. The question that they'd asked in the survey had been, people can tell I'm transgender/gender nonconforming even if I don't tell them, with responses that varied from 0 to 4, with 0 being never and 4 being always. Instead, they could have asked, people perceive me as a gender nonconforming version of my assigned gender at birth, and people perceive me as a gender nonconforming for the gender that I've transitioned to. This wording would have been far clearer because it would alleviate the concern that respondents might reply to it under the understanding that this question was asking if they pass as the gender they have transitioned to. Anyone can be gender nonconforming. Think of how Harry Styles has worn dresses. Passing refers to a transgender person being read as the gender that they have transitioned to. For example, a transgender man might either be read as a woman in a dress or a man in a dress, depending on if he passes. In the first circumstance, he is read as gender conforming, but not passing, whereas in the second circumstance, he is read as gender nonconforming, but passes. There's a whole wealth of literature and discussion surrounding the politics of passing, and Chase Ross is a researcher who's dedicated much of his focus on issues related to transgender identity. So, if you're interested in reading some more, definitely check him out. Shifting gears though, let's look at the hypotheses, of which there are three main ones. The first believed that an increase in perceived gender nonconformity would be associated with an increase in exposure to day-to-day and major events of transphobic discrimination. The second asked if more exposure to transphobic discrimination would be associated with a greater likelihood of engaging in health-harming behaviors like smoking, attempted suicide, and drug or alcohol abuse. The third hypothesis kind of synthesized these two initial hypotheses by asking if transphobic discrimination might explain why gender nonconforming transgender people may have worse health problems. So, in relation to the first hypothesis, they'd used Goffman's stigma to visibility ideas to bolster the belief that gender nonconformity acts as a discredited status that transform a transgender person's transgender status from a discreditable status to a discredited one. In their literature review, they also referenced the minority stress model, which has developed a bit in the past 3 decades, and basically stipulates that having a minority status leads to increased exposure to distal stressors, which leads to increased exposure to proximal stressors, and the increased exposure to these two stressors result in adverse health outcomes. Distal stressors are external stresses, whereas proximal stresses are internal ones. Think of rejection as an example of a distal stressor, and the shame that it results as a result of that rejection is a proximal stressor. Anyways, enough context and more onto the methodology of the study. They conducted their study by using the National Transgender Discrimination Survey in 2011 as a vehicle for completion. They'd had the survey sent out through 800 transgender serving community organizations and 150 active transgender community email listservs, and in addition to that online survey, they sent out paper versions of it to homeless shelters, legal aid clinics, and mobile health clinics. In all, they analyzed 4,115 binary transgender individuals, referring to transgender individuals who distinctly categorize their gender as a transgender man or transgender woman. The data analysis of the results confirmed the hypotheses of this study, essentially saying that yes, increased gender nonconformity is affiliated with higher rates of transphobic discrimination, increased rates of transphobic discrimination are associated with higher rates of health-harming behaviors, and they also found that gender nonconformity may be a reason for an increase in health-harming behaviors because it opens transgender people up to more transphobic discrimination, tying back to the minority stress model. We're skipping Table 1 and Table 2 because we don't have time for it, but here it is. And if you want to talk about the findings of this part of the survey, believe me, I do have thoughts on them as well. Table 2 basically showed that gender nonconformity is significantly and positively associated with attempted suicide, even when controlling for medical transition statuses and social status, the latter of which refers to living full-time as your gender goal or not living full-time as your gender goal. Tables 4 and 5 also show a similar association for drug or alcohol abuse and smoking, but Model 4 in this graph shows that the associations between those last two health-harming behaviors become non-significant when there are controls for transphobic discrimination. Remember how we mentioned Harry Styles earlier? Far-right conservative online troll Candace Owens had bashed on him for the way he'd expressed himself and cited that gender nonconformity was indicative of mental illness, as seen by icons such as Queen, Bowie, and Prince having caved to substance abuse. Yeah, so studies like this prove that Owens is talking a lot of smack and doesn't really know what she's talking about, especially because the study points to the fact that discrimination causes the health-harming behaviors, not that one's identity does. Okay, and as per usual, time limits are the bane of my existence, so I do have to wrap this up a little prematurely. If you want to talk more on this topic, or even read the article yourself, here's a QR code you can scan to access the PDF. And here's a few ways you can contact me to ramble about the topic. The final concluding thoughts of the paper had emphasized that the onus is ultimately upon society to expand the possibilities of gender so that transgender individuals may lead more livable lives, an idea that had been encouraged by Judith Butler and Judith Lorber in their works. I take this to be super important in informing how we form legislation regarding transgender people. Stuff like the military ban against transgender people and healthcare protections having to address health needs for transgender people need to take note of some of the findings from this survey. Anyways, that concludes this segment. Thank you guys for watching, and y'all better say some stuff because I really want to ramble more about this. So, comment. Thank you. Bye.